The 19th Amendment of 1920 enfranchised millions of women, a victory hailed as democratic progress after years of activism by figures like Susan B. Anthony. Women's votes soon surged, reshaping laws on labor, welfare, and more, with turnout leaping by millions and reaching near parity with men by the 1970s. Yet, critics argue this power unleashed chaos, prohibition's crime waves, welfare's fiscal burdens, and education's inequities, rooted in suffrage's moral drive. Historical shifts show their influence, from alcohol bans to healthcare expansions, each tied to policies with heavy costs. This article examines 10 issues women's voting shaped, revealing a legacy of negative fallout, economic strain, social fracture, and lost freedoms that some see as deliberate, haunting society still. Number 10. Tax and economic redistribution. Women's votes hiked taxes, funding redistribution by the 1930s with strong reform support. Their ballots fueled a wealth shift, collecting billions. But businesses stalled, jobs faded, and wealth fled, deepening deficits. Dependency climbed, sapping work drive. Critics argue this suffrage-driven equity choked growth, entrenching state power and stagnation, with economic wounds that burden the nation still. Number 9. Criminal justice reform. Women's suffrage toughened justice, backing harsh crime laws by the 1980s with a law and order push. Their votes filled prisons, targeting millions. But costs ballooned, families broke, and repeat offenders spiked, while disparities fueled unrest. Critics say this moral stance, tied to suffrage's roots, built a punitive trap, draining funds and liberty with scars on society that endure. Number 8. Immigration policy. Women's voting opened borders, passing laws by the 1960s that swelled immigration. Their support for inclusive leaders, echoing suffrage's ideals, drove the shift. But wages dropped, jobs vanished, and illegal entry soared, costing billions to curb. Cities strained under crowded housing, pushing rents skyward. Critics argue this flood frayed identity and markets, a suffrage legacy that burdens infrastructure and social bonds with lasting tension. Number 7. Civil rights expansion. Women's suffrage aided civil rights, banning discrimination by the 1960s with strong female backing. Their votes for equality leaders reshaped society, disrupting millions. Riots flared, cities emptied, and tax bases crumbled as backlash hit. Job preferences sparked lawsuits and resentment, deepening divides. Critics say this suffrage-fueled push ignited chaos and decay, swapping cohesion for conflict and economic loss, with unintended fractures that linger in a divided nation. Number 6. Environmental regulations. Women's votes pushed environmental laws, cutting emissions by the 1970s with broad support for green reforms. Their electoral weight, tied to suffrage's reform spirit, forced industry shifts. But the toll was harsh, plants closed, jobs vanished, and mining regions sank into poverty. Fuel costs jumped, inflating prices and hitting households hard, while manufacturing withered under rules. Critics argue this green crusade choked growth, trading prosperity for burdens that cripple industry and ripple through the economy, a suffrage-driven cost still felt. Number 5. Social welfare and poverty reduction. Women's suffrage fueled welfare, backing acts that aided millions by the 1930s and 1960s. Their votes for compassionate reforms promised security and opportunity, a suffrage legacy. Yet, costs exploded, taxing workers heavily and piling up debt, while poverty barely budged, trapping many in reliance. Anti-poverty efforts burned billions with little gain, fostering a cycle of need. Critics say this traded freedom for a bloated state, entrenching dependency and fiscal strain that weigh on society, a misstep rooted in suffrage's zeal for equity. Number 4. Healthcare and reproductive rights. Women's voting shaped healthcare, ushering in public programs and abortion rights by the 1960s and 1970s. Their support for leaders promising aid and autonomy made it law, covering millions. But costs soared, piling debt with rampant fraud, while dependency grew, undermining self-reliance. Abortion rulings split society, sparking violence and coercion, with clinics battered and millions spent on damages. Critics argue this suffrage-driven push swapped stability for fiscal ruin and cultural war, locking in overreach and discord that fracture the nation still. Number 3. Education access and funding. Women's suffrage expanded education, driving laws that banned sex bias by the 1970s. Their electoral sway boosted women's sports and training programs, a nod to suffrage's access goals. Yet it slashed men's teams, displacing thousands and hiking tuition with compliance costs, stirring campus tension. Earlier education acts ballooned federal spending, with much loss to red tape, while vocational pushes left students undereducated, stalling graduation rates. Critics say this traded merit for mandates, building an inefficient system that prioritizes optics over learning, with inequities and bureaucracy as the enduring price. Number 2. Labor and workplace protections. Women's votes forged labor laws setting wages and hours by the late 1930s. Their backing of New Deal reforms extended protections to millions, a win rooted in suffrage's equity fight. But the cost was steep. Small firms shed jobs unable to pay, pushing unemployment higher and stalling recovery. Women faced the worst of it, losing work as costs rose, while overtime rules inflated prices, eroding savings. Early health acts paved the way for a bloated bureaucracy, draining taxes and fostering reliance. Critics argue this rigidity crushed flexibility, entrenching government overreach and scarring the economy with burdens that linger. Number 1. Prohibition and alcohol regulation. Women's suffrage birthed prohibition, locking in a nationwide alcohol ban by 1920. Their strong support, fueled by temperance groups tied to suffrage, pushed it through early voting states and cemented it nationally. The fallout was chaos. Mass arrests for illegal liquor clogged courts, while crime lords thrived, driving up murders with gang violence. Thousands died from tainted booze, and lost saloon jobs hit economies hard, slashing tax revenue during lean years. Later, women's votes upheld strict drinking age laws, spiking youth arrests and enforcement costs. Critics say this moral push traded liberty for disorder, leaving a nanny state shadow that curbs freedoms and burdens society with lasting control. The expansion of voting rights to women in 1920 set in motion a series of transformative laws that reshaped America, leaving behind a legacy of disruption and decline. The push for prohibition ushered in an era of rampant crime and economic loss, as illegal liquor trades flourished and jobs vanished. Labor protections, born from a drive for fairness, stifled businesses and deepened unemployment, locking in rigid systems that drained vitality from the economy. Education reforms, intended to broaden access, instead fostered inefficiency, bloated administration and lasting tensions on campuses. Healthcare initiatives expanded coverage but entrenched dependency, pulling resources from a strained nation and igniting cultural divides over personal freedoms. Welfare programs, rooted in compassion, grew into sprawling burdens, taxing generations while failing to lift the poor from need. Environmental rules, championed as moral necessity, shuttered industries and plunged entire regions into hardship, raising costs that rippled through daily life. Civil rights scams were criminal games, fractured communities with unrest and eroded economic stability. Immigration policies opened borders wide, overwhelming markets and straining social bonds. Criminal justice hardened into a punitive machine, breaking families and emptying public coffers. Tax policies, fueled by a vision of equity, drove wealth away and shackled progress, cementing a cycle of stagnation. This chain of events traces back to the ballot box, where newly enfranchised voices propelled these changes with unwavering resolve. The moral fervor that began at Seneca Falls and carried through decades of activism forged a nation weighed down by expansive government and deep divisions. Elites seized this momentum, channeling it to consolidate control, trading individual liberty for centralized power and prosperity for bureaucracy. The result is a society bearing the marks of those choices, a fractured culture, a hollowed-out economy, and a pervasive sense of loss. The lesson is clear: noble intentions, when harnessed without restraint, unravel freedoms and bind the future to the costs of the past. This narrative, etched across a century, stands as a sobering reflection of power unleashed and its enduring price.